Hello everyone! Today I am going to explain a paper from April jointly published by DeepSeek and Tsinghua University. What it discusses isn't actually about training a model to answer questions, but rather how to build a model that scores multiple answers. This is what they call a reward model. And this concept of inference time scaling refers to a method where, for a given question, you generate multiple answers and then score those answers to select the best one. This approach increases computational effort during testing to deliver better results to users. Alright, so now it's addressing this issue, reward models. There are several ways to categorize them. The first way is that, given a question and several answers, you only assign a single score. That's one type. Or you could provide a critique, meaning a linguistic evaluation, along with a score. That's another type. Alternatively, you might just give a linguistic evaluation without a score. Another way to classify them is that you can score any number of answers, meaning each answer gets its own score. Or T, here, is a type where you can only score paired answers, like saying the first answer is better than the second in terms of score. So, with these two scoring methods, one with 3 cases and one with 2 cases, you get a total of 6 scenarios. These 6 scenarios differ in 2 key properties. The first property is input flexibility, which refers to the flexibility of the input. If you can score multiple answers individually, that's flexible. But if you can only score them in pairs, like pair-wise scoring, then it's not flexible. So pair-wise methods are inflexible. The second property is inference time scalable, which means that if your scoring only provides a basic score without a linguistic evaluation, it's not inference time scalable. Because in that case, you can't improve the results by increasing computation. But if you provide a linguistic evaluation, you can assign different evaluations based on different criteria and give different scores. That makes it more inference time scalable. So, the best outcome is when you give each answer a score along with a linguistic evaluation. Next, they discuss this question: should we provide a set of principles before evaluating? In other words, if you provide a series of evaluation principles and then score based on those, would the results be more accurate than if you just gave an evaluation and score without any principles? This table shows that if you generate some principles yourself and then evaluate the answers based on those self-generated principles, the results might not necessarily be good. But if you generate those answers and filter them, meaning you remove the bad principles, then the results improve compared to the original outcome. So, it's saying you absolutely need some high-quality principles, and these principles are actually generated by the reward model itself. Now, let's talk about how to train it. This one diagram basically explains the entire work of this paper. The first stage is called rejective fine-tuning. It's a form of supervised learning, but it has a kind of rejective process. How does it work? First, you are given a question and several answers. You let this reward model, GRM, generate several groups of principles, with each group containing multiple criteria, like how well it follows instructions, whether the details are sufficient, whether it's safe or not, things like that. You can generate multiple groups of principles. Based on each group of principles, you evaluate the answers. For example, if there are only 2 answers, you might say the first is better than the second and give it a score. Then, based on the second group of principles, you assign another score. Finally, you check whether the scores you assigned match the actual ranking. Like in the dataset, you need to know which answer is better or the best. The answers in this dataset come with ground truth. If every group of principles you generate leads to the correct answer, like saying answer 1 is better than answer 2, and it's actually true, then it's too simple, and you don't use that data. But if some are correct and some are wrong, you take the correct ones and use them for supervised training. In other words, you sample your own data, keep the good samples for supervised training, and discard the bad ones. That's what's called rejective. Rejecting a portion of the data. But T here is a problem here. Sometimes all the groups of principles fail to produce the correct answer. In other words, according to those principles, the answer you think is better isn't actually the best. So, they used a technique called hinted sampling. Hinted sampling means you tell the reward model which answer is the best and then let it generate principles to explain why that one is the best. This way, you can sample good principles. They found a problem though. Sometimes during this process, the model takes shortcuts with the generated critics. That means it doesn't provide reliable principles to arrive at the correct answer. It just jumps to the answer or gives unreasonable principles. So, this method isn't perfect either. That's where reinforcement learning comes in. They used reinforcement learning with an algorithm called GRPO, which compares the results from different samples. Specifically, you input a question and some generated answers. It samples and generates a group of principles. Say it's supposed to generate n groups, but here it shows just one for illustration. Based on that group, it produces an answer. Then you check that answer against RMaxRL, which is the true reward, or score for each answer, finding the highest one. You see if it matches the result from your principles. Like if the principles say the second answer is better, and it actually is, then the reward is 1. If the sampled group of principles leads to a wrong answer, it's -1. This way, you get a GRPO reward, and you use an algorithm to train the GLM. So, we can see when to use reinforcement learning in simple terms. It's like this. If we have a question, an answer, and the process, we use supervised learning to train. Input is the question, and the output is the process and final answer, training the model to generate both. But if you only have the question and the final correct answer without the process, then during sampling, sometimes you get a process and an answer. Some processes lead to wrong answers, some to correct ones. You give a high reward to the ones that lead to correct answers and a negative reward to those that lead to wrong answers. That's how reinforcement learning works. Now, how do you increase computation during testing to improve the model's results? Here's how it works. Given a question and several answers, you don't know which is better. You can simultaneously sample n groups of principles, and each group gives an evaluation and a final score. In the end, if you sample 4 groups, for example, you get 4 sets of scores, sum them up, and get a final score for each answer. You pick the highest scoring one. That's what you present to the user. The more groups of principles and critics you sample, the more final scores you sum up through voting, and statistically, that makes it more accurate. That's how you increase computation during testing to improve results. Alright, then they propose another idea called meta-reward model. What does that mean? It means some groups of principles are good and some are bad. For example, the second and fourth groups might be bad. So we don't use them for voting, we only sum the first and third groups. The result you get this way might differ from summing all of them. So how do you get this meta-reward model? The meta-reward model is essentially a reward model trained to evaluate the reward model. How is it trained? Let's look again. Earlier, when we sampled, some groups of principles led to correct answers, and some led to wrong ones. For the ones that led to correct answers, we label them as 1. For those that led to wrong answers, we label them as 0. Then we train this meta-reward model to predict between 1 and 0. This way, the groups it labels as 0, those principles and answers, are the bad ones, and we discard them. That's what a meta-reward model is. So, what this paper talks about with increasing computation at test time isn't about generating a longer chain of thought. Instead, it's about letting the question, answering model sample and generate multiple answers, while your reward model samples multiple groups of evaluation principles to pick the best answer to present to the user. This is a different dimension of increasing computation at test time to get better answers. Thank you, everyone.